I'll address some things as the supervisor. There will be no comments. There will be anything. It will be me addressing you guys, telling you what's going on the township.
In our CBA, that's our collective bargaining agreement, that's our union contract. So it comes with the seat. That's what people are not saying. I didn't make this up. I didn't just create this.
Tiffany Henyard, once seen as an unstoppable force in Dalton's political landscape, now finds herself at the center of a growing investigation that is sending shockwaves through her inner circle and beyond. Her name has been plastered across headlines, but not for the reasons she had hoped. Allegations of corruption, financial misconduct, and abuse of power are beginning to pile up, and scrutiny over her dubious activities grows every day. The very people who once stood by her side, including her own partner, are now turning against her at a pace faster than anyone could have predicted. According to sources, even her baby daddy is cooperating with authorities, offering details that could have devastating consequences for Tiffany's future. The federal government is reportedly conducting an in-depth probe into her affairs, and those she once trusted to shield her are now working with law enforcement in their pursuit of justice to understand how Tiffany's world came crashing down. It's essential to examine the path she took to power, a journey marked not only by ambition, but by a carefully crafted image of invulnerability. Throughout her time in office, Tiffany surrounded herself with loyal allies, individuals whose devotion appeared unwavering. Yet many of these figures had their own questionable reputations, creating an intricate web of enablers and scapegoats. She had strategically built a network of fall guys, people she believed would take the blame if any illicit activities were exposed. But as the investigation into her shady dealings picked up steam, Tiffany found herself unable to escape the mounting pressure, once capable of manipulating public perception and dodging accountability. Tiffany attempted to retreat from media scrutiny, hoping that the storm would pass and the controversy would die down. However, the FBI was allegedly closing in, making it increasingly difficult for her to remain in the shadows. The moment she tried to disappear, it became clear her power was beginning to erode. Those she relied on were no longer willing to protect her from the consequences of her actions. One by one, her supposed protectors began flipping, and the walls she had built around herself started to crumble. The most shocking betrayal came from her own partner, Kamal Woods. Kamal, Tiffany's longtime boyfriend, wasn't just romantically linked to her. He was deeply entangled in her business operations, making his involvement a critical aspect of the investigation. While he had been portrayed as a loyal companion, his willingness to cooperate with authorities suggests his role in Tiffany's alleged schemes was far more complex than anyone initially believed. Kamal wasn't just a passive figure in Tiffany's world. He was a significant player, having been named the director of her cancer foundation, a move that had already raised suspicions. The foundation, which was ostensibly created to support breast cancer patients, is now under intense scrutiny. Investigators are questioning whether it was truly a charitable organization or just a publicity stunt. On the very day the foundation was officially launched, it received a sizable donation, further fueling speculation about its true purpose. As authorities dug deeper into its financial records, many began to suspect that the foundation was being used as a front for other, less charitable endeavors. This revelation, combined with the unraveling of Tiffany's support system, left her in a precarious position with nowhere left to hide. Once viewed as untouchable, Tiffany now faces the harsh reality that her political empire may be on the verge of total collapse. With federal authorities closing in, her once loyal allies turning against her, and the public demanding answers, the question remains: how much longer can she evade the consequences of her actions? The investigation has also brought to light serious concerns about her misuse of public funds. Reports indicate that she used taxpayer money to finance a trip outside of Dalton to promote her foundation, an action that effectively turned public funds into a tool for advancing her personal agenda. Worse still, she allegedly used taxpayer dollars to pay her employees, including Kamal Woods, who played a significant role in her questionable dealings. Despite the growing number of red flags, Tiffany continued funneling public money into her foundation, operating under the assumption that she was untouchable. But when federal authorities stepped in, things began to take a dramatic turn. The feds arrived with subpoenas demanding access to crucial documents related to her financial transactions. Kamal, who had been receiving a paycheck from Tiffany's dubious foundation, was exposed for securing a lucrative position in Thornton Township, earning a salary of over $100,000, an amount most Dalton residents could only dream of. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Kamal's name appeared in the subpoenas, signaling that authorities were expanding their probe beyond Tiffany and into the financial activities of those in her inner circle. Tiffany herself was hit with 2 subpoenas, one of which delved into her private business dealings. Investigators uncovered an intricate web of enterprises that were as murky as her political affairs. Among these businesses were a restaurant and a property management firm, both of which raised serious concerns about their legitimacy. One particularly egregious case involved a tenant who lost their home in 2019 due to hazardous living conditions, including a mold-infested and leaking building. Clear evidence that Tiffany's business practices were far from ethical as the investigation continued to dig deeper into Tiffany's affairs. It became increasingly clear that her empire had been built on a foundation of deceit and financial manipulation. What makes this downfall even more dramatic is that the very people she had trusted to protect her interests are now assisting law enforcement in their pursuit of justice. Tiffany's long-standing pattern of cutting corners, abusing power, and prioritizing personal wealth over the well-being of the community is catching up with her in ways she never anticipated. She may have once believed she was invincible, but the mounting evidence against her suggests otherwise. With federal investigators closing in, her days of unchecked authority are numbered. The most stunning betrayal of all comes from her own baby daddy, once seen as a dependable figure in her life, but now reportedly cooperating with authorities. His willingness to provide information could prove to be the final blow that dismantles Tiffany's carefully constructed facade of power and influence as the investigation gains momentum. More of Tiffany's secrets are being exposed, painting a damning picture of a leader who prioritized self-interest over the responsibilities of public service. The once loyal allies who helped her maintain control are now turning their backs, ensuring that law enforcement has everything they need to hold her accountable. The story of Tiffany Henyard serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of corruption and unchecked ambition, a reminder that even those who believe themselves untouchable can ultimately be brought down by the very people they once relied on. What began as a meteoric rise to power is now unraveling into a dramatic and humiliating downfall. With each new revelation, Tiffany's fate seems more sealed. As she faces the consequences of her actions, one thing remains certain: the next chapter of this saga will be even more explosive. The full extent of her alleged crimes will soon come to light, and with federal authorities closing in, former allies testifying against her, and her once loyal inner circle collapsing, Tiffany Henyard's reign appears to be reaching its inevitable and dramatic end.
Damage, and then it leaked one into my kitchen, and the window sill leaked in my daughter's room.
Except they weren't. Enter activist David Lowry, who called Dalton directly. Suddenly, the house deemed livable on September 3rd became unfit for occupancy on October 15th. Lowry's theory?
The trustees do something.
As the investigation into Tiffany Henyard's alleged corruption intensified, more individuals came forward to expose her actions, a development she should have anticipated, given the controversy that had surrounded her administration from the very start. Just 6 months after taking over as supervisor of Thornton Township, the FBI began delving deeper into her operations, recognizing that they needed a full understanding of her business dealings. The federal authorities formally requested all records related to her political fund, charity foundation, and township operations, signaling that her financial activities were under intense scrutiny even before the investigation escalated. Long before the federal probe took off, Tiffany had already faced mounting criticism within her own ranks, particularly from members of her so-called Dream Team, a group she had personally selected to help her run the township. Tiffany likely assumed this would be a loyal and cooperative administration, but the reality proved to be far from harmonious. Trustees Tiana Beller and Jason House, along with village clerk Allison Key, were initially expected to be her closest allies. However, they quickly became some of her most vocal critics, refusing to overlook the unethical and questionable decisions she was making. What was supposed to be a united front in governance swiftly turned into a nightmare for Tiffany, as the very people she had handpicked to support her began challenging her leadership and exposing her questionable actions. Tensions grew, and the trustees, who were originally chosen for their perceived loyalty, began working with the village board to take legal action against Tiffany, accusing her of serious conflicts of interest. Their main concern was the growing evidence that she was using her position not to serve the people of Dalton, but to further her own personal and financial interests. This legal battle, which erupted just 6 months into her tenure, exposed the deep fractures within her administration and solidified the growing opposition against her. Instead of taking responsibility for her actions or addressing the concerns raised by the trustees, Tiffany retaliated in a desperate attempt to regain control. She accused them of deliberately inciting controversy and working against her vision to make Dalton great. In doing so, she painted herself as a victim of a political witch hunt rather than an official under investigation for serious misconduct. This response only deepened the rift between her and her former allies, making it clear that she was unwilling to acknowledge any wrongdoing. Meanwhile, the federal investigation into her business dealings only intensified, further eroding any remaining credibility she had. With the FBI scrutinizing every aspect of her political fund and charity foundation, it became increasingly difficult for Tiffany to maintain the facade of legitimacy she had carefully constructed. The scrutiny extended to the township's finances, raising even more questions about how public funds were being managed under her leadership. What had begun as whispers of corruption soon turned into an undeniable storm of allegations. With more individuals stepping forward to expose the truth about her administration, the turning point came when those who had once been Tiffany's staunchest supporters began publicly distancing themselves from her. They recognized that the legal consequences of being associated with her could be severe. Tiffany, who had once projected an image of being untouchable, was now watching her empire unravel before her eyes. Every attempt to silence her critics seemed to backfire, reinforcing the perception that she was more concerned with self-preservation than with the well-being of the township. She had been elected to serve. The lawsuit filed by the trustees further cemented the idea that Tiffany's administration was riddled with conflicts of interest. As the legal battles piled up, it became increasingly clear that Tiffany was running out of options. What had started as a seemingly unstoppable rise to power was turning into a slow but inevitable downfall, driven by her own actions and the unwillingness of those around her to continue, enabling her. The deeper the investigation went, the more it became evident that Tiffany's leadership had been built on a foundation of corruption, manipulation, and self-serving decisions. Her refusal to take responsibility, combined with her aggressive attempts to retaliate against anyone who opposed her, only accelerated her downfall. The very people she had relied on to protect her were now among those working to hold her accountable. With federal authorities determined to uncover the full extent of her misdeeds and former allies aligning against her, Tiffany Henyard's political career appeared to be in its final, chaotic chapter as the investigation gained momentum. Tiffany's tactics became darker and more authoritarian. She began barring trustees from their offices in an attempt to intimidate them. But rather than backing down, the trustees remained steadfast in their determination to remove her. They even went so far as to hold meetings without her involvement. Some might have questioned whether they were overstepping, but the reality was that Tiffany's leadership had been failing Dalton in almost every way under Tiffany's rule. The town was grappling with urgent issues: crumbling roads, neglected and rundown houses, and a police force in desperate need of resources. Yet, instead of addressing these pressing problems, Tiffany continued to squander public funds on frivolous expenses. Before she became mayor, Dalton had been a town that prioritized community unity and focused on doing what was best for its residents. However, under her leadership, everything seemed to revolve around her personal image. Any event that didn't directly promote her or elevate her status was either canceled or deliberately undermined. One of the most egregious examples of her self-serving governance was her extravagant spending. Tiffany used taxpayer money for unnecessary billboards featuring her face, first-class flights, luxury accommodations at upscale hotels like the Four Seasons, high-profile DJs, professional photographers, and even a full security team for her own protection. These expenses painted a clear picture of a leader more concerned with personal prestige than with the well-being of her constituents. Her behavior became even more apparent when she actively obstructed a long-standing community event simply because it did not center around her. The event, which had been an important annual tradition for Dalton's residents, was scheduled to proceed as planned, but Tiffany refused to grant permission for the use of the public park. Her reason? She had scheduled her own competing event just a few miles away and didn't want anything to take attention away from it. In an extreme move to ensure the community gathering couldn't take place, she ordered massive cement blocks to be placed at the entrance of the park. Physically preventing residents from attending this act of blatant obstruction demonstrated the extent to which Tiffany prioritized her personal reputation over the welfare and traditions of Dalton. Her leadership consistently reinforced the perception that she was more interested in maintaining her status and power than in serving the very community that had entrusted her with public office. As her grip on power loosened, the cracks in her carefully constructed facade became impossible to ignore. Tiffany Henyard's political career had once been filled with promises of change and progress for Dalton, But as time went on, it became increasingly clear that her ambitions had little to do with improving the lives of the people she was meant to serve. Instead, she became obsessed with maintaining control, silencing opposition, and glorifying herself. The trustees, recognizing that Tiffany's leadership had become a liability to the town, were left with no choice but to take matters into their own hands. They worked behind the scenes to find ways to limit her influence and ultimately, to remove her from power as the months passed. Tiffany's actions continued to expose her true priorities: lavish self-promotion, reckless financial decisions, and retaliatory measures against anyone who dared to challenge her. While Dalton's roads crumbled, vital services went underfunded, and the town faced multiple pressing issues, Tiffany spared no expense in ensuring she remained in the public eye, using taxpayer dollars to construct a persona of grandeur rather than addressing the community's real concerns. Her leadership, once seen as a promising new chapter for Dalton, had quickly devolved into a cautionary tale of unchecked ego, financial irresponsibility, and political manipulation. The investigation into her administration gained momentum, and the voices of her critics grew louder. It became increasingly evident that Tiffany Henyard was not a leader invested in her community. Rather, she was a politician consumed by self-interest, using every available resource to fortify her image at the expense of the people she was elected to serve. One of the most public incidents that illustrated Tiffany's egotistical approach to governance came when an annual car show, organized by local resident Bosley, was abruptly canceled by the mayor. The event, held annually in the parking lot of Needle Park in Dalton, had become a beloved tradition. Bosley had paid $1,000 to the park district for the necessary permit, only to receive a call last Wednesday from Tiffany Henyard's top assistant, informing him that the show would be shut down. The assistant suggested that if Bosley moved the event to Tiffany's location on Greenwood, he could proceed without issue. Bosley took this as a threat. When he showed up at Needle Park on the Saturday morning of the event, he found giant concrete barricades placed at the entrance, and Dalton police were threatening to tow any cars that parked there. It became clear to many that Tiffany was willing to go to great lengths to ensure that her own self-promotional spectacle was not overshadowed by a community gathering. The car show cancellation was just one example of how Tiffany's leadership centered on personal gain rather than the needs of her constituents. As outrageous as Tiffany's actions seemed, they were far from the most scandalous moments of her tenure. The sheer audacity of canceling a beloved community event in favor of a self-serving show painted a clear picture of her egotistical leadership style. Recently, another insider, Carmen Carlisle, came forward to expose Tiffany's manipulative tactics. In a public statement, Carlisle revealed that over the past 2 years, Henyard had been systematically manipulating staff, vendors, and residents to consolidate her power and maintain an iron grip on the township. This revelation confirmed what many had suspected. Tiffany was not a leader working for the betterment of Dalton, but a politician exploiting her position for personal gain. Despite mounting allegations and an escalating federal investigation, Tiffany refused to take responsibility for her actions. Instead, she attempted to deflect blame by pointing fingers at her right-hand man, Keith Freeman. She argued that if anyone should be held accountable for the corruption, financial mismanagement, and abuse of power in her administration, it was him. This attempt to shift the blame was seen by many as a last-ditch effort to save herself. As the walls closed and around her, Tiffany Henyard had long presented herself as a polished and successful leader. But the truth was that her success had been built on the backs of hard-working taxpayers from Thornton Township and the village of Dalton. As investigators began to peel back the layers of her administration, it became clear that her carefully curated image of success was little more than an illusion, one maintained through intimidation, manipulation, and reckless spending. Meanwhile, Keith Freeman, once Tiffany's close and trusted ally, found himself facing legal trouble of his own. He was charged with fraud in a separate FBI probe, further confirming the widespread corruption within Henyard's administration. The indictment of Freeman underscored the reality that those who had once stood by Tiffany were now either turning against her or falling alongside her. The irony of her attempting to shift the blame onto Freeman while he was facing his own legal troubles was not lost on the public. People had already begun to see through her repeated attempts to dodge accountability as more insiders came forward with damning information about Tiffany's conduct. It became increasingly clear that her political empire had been built on deception. The trust she had demanded from her staff, the loyalty she had expected from her allies, and the support she had counted on from her constituents had all eroded, leaving her increasingly isolated. Tiffany could no longer hide behind a manufactured image of leadership. She was being forced to confront the reality of her actions. The ongoing federal investigation ensured that every fraudulent transaction, Every misuse of taxpayer dollars and every abuse of power was being meticulously examined. It was only a matter of time before Tiffany faced the full consequences of her misconduct. Tiffany Henyard had spent years manipulating the system to serve her own interests. But now, as the truth came to light and those closest to her abandoned her one by one, it became evident that her reign was coming to an inevitable and dramatic end. Tiffany Henyard's criminal defense attorney, Bo Brindley, made efforts to defend her by placing the blame on Freeman, arguing that Freeman had been the one responsible for decisions related to how funds were spent. Brindley contended that Tiffany, being a new mayor, was unaware that using taxpayer funds for first-class flights, luxury accommodations at places like the Four Seasons, and lavish spending on public image was improper. She trusted Freeman to guide her, and according to Brindley, Freeman had assured her that these expenses were acceptable. However, despite this defense, it was clear to many that Tiffany was simply trying to distance herself from the fallout. And as absurd as all of this may sound, there were still people in Dalton who continued to support Tiffany Henyard. These supporters argued that she had made politics more accessible and entertaining, and they dismissed the mounting allegations and investigations as political attacks. They believed that the mayor had been unfairly targeted and that the negative portrayals of her were exaggerated despite the overwhelming evidence of corruption, mismanagement, and abuse of power. Tiffany still managed to maintain a loyal following. This was largely due to her ability to control the narrative through social media, which allowed her to present herself as a celebrity figure rather than a public servant. Every time she posted something online, it spread rapidly, further solidifying her status as a well-known figure in the community. However, just because Tiffany had a social media presence and a loyal fan base did not mean she was immune to criticism. In fact, as more revelations about her administration came to light, an increasing number of people were calling her out for her actions. The calls for accountability grew louder, with residents demanding justice for the misuse of public funds, the alleged fraud within her administration, and the blatant self-promotion at the expense of the town she was elected to serve. For many, the question of whether Tiffany Henyard should face legal consequences for her actions was becoming more urgent. People wanted her to be held accountable for her alleged crimes and misdeeds. If she were not held accountable, many wondered, what did that say about the system that allowed her to operate with such impunity for so long? The ongoing investigation led to growing frustration among many residents. The delays in holding Tiffany accountable were seen as a slap in the face to the people of Dalton. The longer she remained in power, the more disillusioned the public became. Residents began to wonder how someone with such a long list of alleged offenses had managed to evade significant consequences for so long. As the revelations continued to unfold, the calls for justice grew louder. People were demanding that Tiffany Henyard face a long-term adult timeout for her actions, regardless of her loyal fan base. Whether or not her supporters wanted to acknowledge it, the reality was that Tiffany's leadership had been marked by scandal after scandal. Her attempts to shift blame, silence critics, and present herself as a victim only served to highlight the extent of the corruption within her administration, her use of taxpayer money for personal gain, her alleged fraudulent activities, and her prioritization of self-promotion over the well-being of Dalton residents had all contributed to her rapid fall from grace. While some still saw her as an embattled leader who was simply misunderstood, the majority recognized the troubling pattern of behavior that had defined her tenure. The debate over Tiffany Henyard's fate was ongoing, and everyone had an opinion on whether she should remain in office or be removed and held accountable. Many believed that her ability to manipulate the media and maintain a loyal base of supporters should not shield her from the consequences of her actions. Allowing her to continue unchecked would set a dangerous precedent for future politicians who might attempt to follow in her footsteps. Others, however, believed that her downfall was inevitable as the legal system and investigative bodies continued to uncover more evidence against her. Regardless of where one stood on the issue, the case of Tiffany Henyard served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked political power and the importance of holding elected officials accountable for their actions. The people of Dalton deserve transparency, honesty, and leadership that prioritize the needs of the community over personal ambition. And as the investigation continued, the question remained, would Tiffany face the consequences of her actions, or would she continue to manipulate the system and evade responsibility? Only time would tell.